For centuries, the story of global exploration has been told as a tale of courage, discovery, and progress. Maps were redrawn, oceans were crossed, and empires were born. Yet behind this familiar narrative lies a far darker reality, one that is rarely discussed in classrooms or celebrated in national histories. From the 15th to the 19th century, Portugal emerged as a driving force behind the transatlantic slave trade. Using its advanced naval power and expanding trade routes, Portuguese ships carried millions of Africans across the Atlantic, most of them sent to Brazil. These voyages were not journeys of opportunity, but forced removals that reshaped entire continents. While Portugal is often remembered as a small nation with an outsized role in exploration, its influence was also built on a system that treated human lives as cargo. This history matters because it did not happen on the margins. It shaped global economies, built immense wealth, and left deep scars that are still visible today. Entire communities in Africa were disrupted, while new societies in the Americas were constructed through unpaid labor. Yet despite the scale of this system, Portugal's central role in it is often softened, overlooked, or completely absent from mainstream education. In this video, we will uncover the hidden side of this history. We will explore how a maritime empire expanded its power, how trade transformed into exploitation, and how the consequences of these actions continue to echo across generations. This is not about assigning blame, it is about understanding the full story. If you value honest history and stories that challenge what we think we know, support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps bring overlooked narratives to light. Stay with us, because this is only the beginning of a story that history tried to forget. As Portugal's ships pushed farther down the West African coast, the enterprise was no longer driven by curiosity alone. What had begun as a search for gold and trade routes gradually transformed into something far more organized and far more troubling. The expansion of Portuguese power at sea required not only ships and sailors, but also a framework that could justify actions many would otherwise question. That framework emerged through a powerful alliance between the Portuguese Crown and the Catholic Church, an alliance that gave moral certainty to imperial ambition and turned exploitation into official policy. In the mid-15th century, Europe was a world where faith shaped law, and law shaped conscience. When Portuguese captains returned from Africa with captives, their actions were not condemned as crimes, but increasingly interpreted as part of a larger religious mission. This shift did not happen by accident. It was formalized through papal bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V, documents that carried immense authority in Christian Europe. These decrees granted the Portuguese monarchy permission to expand its reach into non-Christian lands, to claim territory, and to exert control over those who lived there. In religious language, conquest was reframed as salvation, and domination was presented as a path towards spiritual order. Within this worldview, the act of enslaving non-Christian Africans was portrayed not as cruelty, but as a form of transformation. The idea that forced labor could lead to conversion allowed violence to be masked as benevolence. Captivity became intertwined with religious instruction, and suffering was justified as a necessary step toward a higher state of being. This logic was deeply persuasive in its time because it aligned perfectly with the economic interests of the crown. Labor was essential for building wealth overseas, and the church's approval removed moral hesitation from the process. What might once have been viewed as kidnapping was now protected by both divine authority and royal law. As this belief system took hold, it spread beyond individual voyages and became embedded in institutions. Slave markets operated openly, contracts were drawn, and taxes were collected, all under the assumption that these practices were lawful and righteous. The presence of religious figures within colonial spaces further reinforced the idea that the system itself was legitimate. Baptism did not lead to freedom, and conversion did not erase bondage. Yet the language of faith continued to surround the entire operation. In this way, religion did not merely accompany the expansion of slavery. It helped stabilize and normalize it. This union of power and belief also shaped how the story would later be remembered. Because slavery had been sanctioned at the highest levels of both church and state, it became easier for future generations to view it as an unfortunate but acceptable part of history rather than a deliberate choice. The moral responsibility was diffused, hidden behind institutions that claimed to act in the name of order and faith. By the time millions had been transported across the Atlantic, the system was so entrenched that few within Portugal openly questioned its foundations. Understanding this moment is essential to understanding the wider story. The ships, the markets, and the plantations did not exist in isolation. They were supported by ideas that transformed exploitation into duty and conquest into virtue. Once these ideas were accepted, the path was cleared for the vast human trade that would follow, shaping not only Portugal's empire but the modern world itself. As Portugal's overseas expansion accelerated, and its alliance with religious authority reshaped the moral boundaries of empire, Lisbon itself was transformed. The city was no longer simply a departure point for ships or a symbol of maritime ambition. It became a destination where the global trade in human lives converged. Along the banks of the Tagus River, commerce, governance, and ideology fused into a system that placed Lisbon at the very center of the transatlantic slave trade. What unfolded there was not chaotic or hidden, but carefully structured, publicly visible, and firmly embedded within the authority of the state. The arrival of slave ships followed a predictable rhythm. Vessels returning from the African coast docked near the heart of the city, where officials were already prepared to receive their cargo. Enslaved Africans were brought ashore under guard, often weakened by the voyage, yet immediately absorbed into an administrative process that treated their presence as routine. Their bodies were inspected, counted, and recorded, not as individuals with histories and families, but as entries in ledgers that measured value and potential profit. This was the first step in a system that transformed forced displacement into economic order. At the core of this process stood the Casa dos Escravos, an institution that embodied the city's role in the trade. Its function was not merely transactional but symbolic, demonstrating how deeply slavery had been normalized within Portuguese society. Here, the state asserted its control, ensuring that every aspect of the trade was regulated and taxed. Chains and restraints were applied not only to prevent escape, but to signal ownership, turning human movement into managed inventory. Marks placed on bodies served as permanent identifiers, linking individuals to their legal status within a system that recognized them solely as property. Public auctions brought this system into the open. These events were held in central spaces, surrounded by the daily life of the city, where buyers and sellers gathered under official supervision. Transactions unfolded in full view of passers-by, reinforcing the idea that nothing about this trade was illicit or shameful within the prevailing order. The state's presence at these auctions left no doubt about responsibility. Fees were collected, documents were validated, and ownership was transferred with bureaucratic precision. In these moments, Lisbon revealed itself not just as a hub of trade, but as a stage upon which power and control were openly performed. What made Lisbon's role particularly significant was the way these practices influenced the wider Atlantic world. The systems refined in the capital set standards that were exported overseas, shaping how slavery operated in colonial territories. The methods of registration, taxation, and public sale developed in Lisbon were replicated across ports and plantations, creating a unified structure that allowed the trade to expand efficiently. In this sense, Lisbon functioned as both headquarters and model, ensuring consistency across an empire built on coerced labor. Yet beneath this order lay profound human consequences. Each transaction represented a life redirected, a future decided by strangers, and a connection to home severed. The city's streets, markets, and institutions absorbed these realities so completely that they became invisible to many who lived among them. Over time, the presence of enslaved Africans became an accepted part of Lisbon's social landscape. their labor woven into households, workshops, and docks, while the mechanisms that governed their lives faded into the background of everyday routine. Understanding Lisbon's transformation is essential to understanding the scale of Portugal's involvement in the slave trade. This was not a distant colonial practice carried out beyond Europe's borders. It was organized, supervised, and legitimized at the heart of the empire, by hosting institutions like the Casa dos Escravos and embedding slavery within its administrative core. Lisbon became a central engine of a global system whose effects would be felt across continents and centuries, leaving traces that history can no longer afford to overlook. As the machinery of slavery became firmly established in Lisbon and across the Portuguese Empire, the human cost of this system revealed itself not in abstraction, but in daily lived experience. The institutions that regulated the trade gave it an appearance of order, yet for those caught within it, life was defined by constant control and the steady erosion of dignity. Enslaved Africans were not only displaced from their homes, they were reshaped by a system designed to assert absolute dominance over their bodies, labor, and identities. Upon arrival, restraint became a defining feature of existence. Iron collars and shackles were used to restrict movement and signal status, making captivity visible at all times. These devices were not temporary measures but enduring reminders of ownership, intended to discourage resistance and reinforce hierarchy. Marks placed on the body served a similar purpose, linking individuals permanently to a system that viewed them as assets rather than people. Such practices were not hidden acts of cruelty but standardized procedures embedded within legal and commercial frameworks, reinforcing the idea that domination was both acceptable and necessary. Daily life under enslavement revolved around labor that demanded total compliance. Women and children were assigned tasks that sustained households, workshops, docks, and later plantations across the empire. Work was relentless, often extending from early morning until nightfall, leaving little room for rest or personal autonomy. Productivity was measured, monitored, and enforced, and failure to meet expectations carried consequences. The law granted owners broad authority to discipline those under their control, as long as life itself was not extinguished. This threshold, vague and inconsistently applied, placed enslaved individuals in a constant state of vulnerability, where security depended entirely on the will of another. For many women, the experience of enslavement carried additional burdens. Their labor extended beyond physical work into intimate spaces, where power imbalances erased the possibility of consent. Relationships formed under such conditions reflected inequality rather than choice. Yet the outcomes of these encounters shaped social realities within the empire. Mixed heritage children were born into a world that struggled to define their place, often reinforcing existing hierarchies rather than challenging them. Religious authorities occasionally condemned the moral disorder that resulted, yet rarely confronted the system that produced it. What made this environment particularly devastating was its normalization. Violence did not always appear as sudden or dramatic acts. It was woven into routines, expectations, and rules. Discipline was framed as correction, restraint as necessity, and suffering as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of maintaining order. Over time, these justifications dulled empathy and transformed injustice into background noise. Enslaved Africans navigated a world where survival depended on adaptation, endurance, and, when possible, subtle forms of resistance that preserved fragments of identity. Despite the constraints, moments of agency did exist. Some individuals negotiated limited freedoms, earned small wages, or sought pathways toward manumission, often through extraordinary effort and sacrifice. Others formed communities within captivity, maintaining cultural practices and bonds that defied complete erasure. These acts did not overturn the system, but they demonstrated resilience in the face of overwhelming control. Each small assertion of humanity stood in quiet contrast to a structure built to deny it. This lived reality gives meaning to the institutions and policies that sustained slavery. Behind every ledger entry and official decree were countless lives shaped by fear, labor, and uncertainty. Understanding this dimension is essential, because it reveals slavery not merely as an economic engine or historical phase, but as a sustained experience of dehumanization that touched every aspect of existence. The legacy of that experience did not end with the closing of markets or the passing of laws. It continued through generations, leaving imprints that still influence societies today. As the systems refined in Lisbon expanded beyond Europe, their most far-reaching impact unfolded across the Atlantic in Brazil. What had begun as a regulated trade centered in the Portuguese capital evolved into a vast colonial enterprise where forced labor became the engine of an entire society. Brazil did not simply participate in slavery. It absorbed it on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the world. Over the course of more than 3 centuries, approximately 5.5 million Africans were transported there, their labor shaping the land, the economy, and the social order of the colony. The earliest Portuguese settlements in Brazil revealed both opportunity and challenge. The territory was immense, the climate demanding, and European settlers were few. To make the colony profitable, labor was essential, and enslaved Africans became the solution. Along the northeastern coast, sugar plantations spread rapidly, transforming the landscape into fields organized for export rather than local sustenance. Sugar soon became Brazil's primary commodity, linking distant plantations to global markets and generating enormous wealth for colonial elites and the Portuguese Crown. Behind every shipment leaving Brazilian ports stood countless hours of unpaid labor performed under constant supervision. As the colony expanded inward, new resources intensified the demand for labor. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 17th century shifted the economic center toward the interior, drawing settlers and administrators into mining regions that relied almost entirely on enslaved workers. Extraction required physical endurance and precise organization, and enslaved Africans were forced to meet both demands: roads, transport networks, and urban centers emerged to support these industries, all built upon a workforce that had no claim to the wealth it produced. The profits flowed outward, reinforcing Portugal's position within the global economy while leaving Brazil dependent on a system of exploitation. Even as mining declined, slavery remained central. Cattle ranching and food production expanded to sustain growing populations. And in the 19th century, coffee rose to prominence as a new pillar of the economy. Plantations multiplied, particularly in the southeast, and the continued importation of enslaved Africans ensured that labor supply kept pace with expansion. By this point, slavery was not merely an economic practice, but a defining feature of Brazilian society. Social status, political power, and racial hierarchy were all shaped by proximity to ownership and control of enslaved labor. What distinguished Brazil from other slave societies was not only the scale of enslavement, but its duration. While other regions moved toward abolition earlier, Brazil remained deeply invested in the system until the late 19th century. The long reliance on forced labor influenced cultural norms and institutional structures, embedding inequality into the fabric of the nation. Urban life, rural production, and colonial governance all revolved around a workforce denied freedom, creating patterns that persisted long after legal abolition. For the enslaved, Brazil represented both a place of survival and immense hardship. Lives were defined by grueling work, surveillance, and limited autonomy, yet communities formed through shared experience. Cultural practices, beliefs, and resistance strategies crossed the Atlantic alongside the people themselves, shaping Brazilian identity in ways that endure today. These contributions, born from suffering, stand in contrast to the conditions under which they were made. Understanding Brazil's rise as the world's largest slave society is essential to understanding the broader Portuguese Empire. The wealth that flowed through Lisbon and into Europe was inseparable from the labor extracted in Brazil. Slavery was not a peripheral element of colonial development. It was its foundation. The economic structures built during this period created legacies of inequality that continue to influence Brazil's social and economic realities, reminding us that the past is not distant history, but a force that still shapes the present. While the wealth generated by slavery flowed steadily toward European ports and colonial capitals, its cost was borne most heavily in Africa itself. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade did not end at the shoreline where ships departed. It reshaped entire regions, altering demographic patterns, economic systems, and social relationships in ways that would endure for centuries. What unfolded across the continent was not a single moment of loss, but a prolonged process of disruption that steadily weakened societies from within. Communities that once relied on agriculture, craftsmanship, and regional trade found their foundations eroding as large portions of the population were removed. The loss was not random. Many of those taken were young and physically capable, the very individuals who sustained families and passed down skills and knowledge. As departures multiplied over generations, population growth slowed. In some areas, reversed. Fields went untended. Production declined, and local economies struggled to maintain stability. The absence of labor did not simply reduce output. It undermined the continuity that allowed societies to adapt and grow. At the same time, the demand for captives introduced new incentives that reshaped power structures. Warfare and raiding became profitable activities, altering the balance between communities. Groups that might once have resolved disputes through negotiation were drawn into cycles of violence, encouraged by access to foreign goods and weapons. Over time, leadership shifted from administrative and cultural authorities toward those who could command force. This militarization fractured trust, making cooperation increasingly difficult and turning fear into a constant presence in daily life. The social consequences of this transformation were profound. Families were torn apart, traditions disrupted, and systems of mutual support weakened. The uncertainty of capture altered how people lived, traveled, and interacted, limiting mobility and discouraging long-term investment in land or trade. In many regions, insecurity became so widespread that development itself was stifled. When survival depends on avoiding capture, planning for the future becomes an unaffordable risk. The effects extended beyond economics and politics into the realm of perception and identity. The global system of slavery attached meanings to skin color that outlasted the trade itself. Africans were increasingly viewed through lenses shaped by exploitation, reinforcing hierarchies that ranked people according to perceived value. These ideas did not disappear when the ships stopped sailing. They became embedded in colonial governance and later influenced post-colonial societies. The association between power, status, and color persisted, shaping access to opportunity and respect long after formal systems of enslavement ended. Health and demographic stability also suffered. Contact with foreign traders introduced diseases that spread rapidly through communities with little immunity, compounding population loss. In some areas, outbreaks claimed individuals in their most productive years, further reducing the capacity for recovery. The combined effects of removal, violence, and illness created cycles of decline that were difficult to escape, especially as external pressures continued. Understanding this devastation requires recognizing that Africa's underdevelopment was not an isolated outcome of internal failure. It was connected to a global system that extracted human resources on an unprecedented scale while redirecting wealth elsewhere. The same processes that fueled growth in Europe and the Americas constrained Africa's ability to build markets, institutions, and infrastructure, Opportunities that might have led to broader prosperity were instead diverted, leaving lasting gaps that still influence economic and social conditions today. This history challenges simplistic narratives about progress and development. It reveals how interconnected the world became through systems that benefited some while severely harming others. The legacy of the slave trade in Africa is not confined to the past. It lives on in patterns of inequality, conflict, and resilience. By understanding these consequences, the broader story of the Atlantic world becomes clearer, showing how the rise of empires was inseparable from the long-term costs imposed on the societies they exploited. When the legal abolition of slavery finally arrived, it was often presented as a moral turning point, a clear break from a dark chapter of history. Yet for Portugal and its African territories, the end of slavery did not bring true freedom or justice. Instead, exploitation took on new forms, reshaped to fit a changing world while preserving the same imbalance of power. The chains were no longer always visible, but control, coercion, and extraction remained deeply rooted in colonial rule. Across Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and São Tomé and Príncipe, colonial policies enforced systems of forced labor that closely mirrored earlier practices. African men and women were compelled to work on plantations, in mines, and on infrastructure projects under harsh conditions, often justified as necessary for development or order. Laws criminalized unemployment, effectively forcing people into labor to avoid punishment. Segregation reinforced these systems, separating European settlers from African populations and reserving political power. Education, an economic opportunity almost exclusively for whites. Military repression became a central tool of governance. Resistance to colonial rule, whether peaceful or armed, was met with force. Villages were displaced, communities were broken apart, and entire regions were destabilized in the name of maintaining control. Economic extraction continued to benefit Portugal, as African colonies supplied raw materials at low cost while serving as protected markets for Portuguese goods. This arrangement sustained the metropole while limiting the ability of African societies to develop independent, diversified economies. Even as the 20th century progressed and global attitudes toward colonialism shifted, meaningful accountability remained absent. While other former slave trading powers began to publicly confront aspects of their past, Portugal largely avoided a full reckoning. There was no formal national apology for its role in the transatlantic slave trade, and no comprehensive effort to address the long-term consequences faced by formerly enslaved peoples and colonized societies. The silence itself became part of the legacy, reinforcing the sense that historical suffering had been acknowledged neither fully nor fairly. The effects of this unfinished history are still visible today. Economic inequality, social divisions, and political instability in parts of Africa cannot be understood without recognizing the centuries of extraction and control that shaped them. These realities are not simply remnants of a distant past. They are the outcomes of decisions made repeatedly over time, long after slavery was officially abolished. Understanding this continuity helps explain why freedom, when it finally came, arrived burdened with obstacles that were never of Africa's making. As this story comes to a close, its purpose is not to dwell on blame, but to encourage understanding. History becomes meaningful when it is examined honestly, without myth or omission, by recognizing how systems of exploitation evolved rather than disappeared. We gain clearer insight into the world we live in today and the responsibilities that come with that knowledge. Thank you for spending your time with this story and for listening to a history that is often overlooked. If you found this video valuable and believe these narratives deserve wider attention, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps ensure that more stories like this can be told, explored, and remembered.